While a recent dip in COVID-19 infections may seem encouraging, experts warn that now is not the time to let our guard down. It's largely because of new variants circulating in the U.S., putting the country once again in the eye of the hurricane, according to one expert. Dr. Peter Hotez, dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, said, "I've been on Zoom calls for the last 2 weeks to see how we're going to manage this. The big wall is about to hit us again, and it's because of the new variants." Joining me on the morning show, Dr. Jonathan Kanter, an epidemiologist with the Penn Center for Epidemiology, no doubt a metaphor for a hurricane. And this storm, not going to pass anytime soon?
No, unfortunately, I think it really isn't. We're in a situation where, we have this hurricane barreling down on us, and we're in a cruise ship in the harbor right now. We've got all the little lifeboats ready to go, but we've just got to get in those lifeboats as quickly as possible and get to shore. And unfortunately, I think the hurricane's coming a lot faster than we can get in the lifeboats, and that's where we're having the trouble right now.
We saw those videos from the parties outside Raymond James Stadium, the bars. People had their own Super Bowl parties and maybe had a few too many people in their houses. There was a lack of mask wearing, lack of social distancing. Is that going to add to a spike that we're going to see in the days and weeks to come?
Well, I think there's no doubt that, as we have seen with every kind of major social holiday type occasion over the past almost year now, it's hard to believe, where we've had spikes afterwards. So it's hard to imagine that we would not have a problem where we're going to have an increase in those numbers as a result of that. So I think I would be shocked if we did not see, a dramatic increase now just because of those behaviors. And of course, some of the other variant discussions that you were mentioning as well.
So we've got the rollout of vaccines. Governor DeSantis said there are more coming this week than there were last week. Johnson & Johnson may get approval sometime in the near future from the FDA. That means more will be available, perhaps in drugstores in the inner city and, in more places in and around Jacksonville. That said, there's a need for drugs to fight COVID, and I understand that there are 2 in development in Israel. Are they showing any promise in clinical trials?
It's very exciting. Early on, the U.S. made a strategic decision to shift the bulk of our focus away from therapeutic approaches, away from ways to treat COVID, people who already had COVID, and towards, approaches to prevent it, like vaccines. And in general, it's actually a very smart public health strategy to say, listen, we've got to figure out how to prevent this in the first place, because if we can do that, we can essentially immunize the entire population. We can get herd immunity. We can get everybody as safe as possible. The problem is, of course, because of that, we don't really have as many therapies as we would probably like for those who unfortunately are already getting infected. So there are a couple trials going on in Israel right now with different approaches. One is, for example, an inhaled medication, which actually deposits directly onto the lungs for those who are already infected with COVID-19. Again, these are in fairly early clinical studies, so we don't yet know if they're definitely going to be effective. But absolutely any glimmer of hope that we can have in terms of options to treat those who've already been infected can be great, because if we can improve their chances of doing well, improve their chances of surviving, and decrease the time they need to be in the hospital or on ventilators, that can be so helpful and so important, not just for them, but for public health at large.
And there's a growing concern there may be more COVID-19 reinfections than we believe, especially with some of these variants, like the UK variant. Does that concern you, and does the U.S. need to start tracking them?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think there's definitely a need to make sure that we're also tracking reinfections. I think that's going to be particularly important now that we're starting to get everybody vaccinated, is to really kind of have a registry of, okay, if you've been vaccinated, did you become infected? Because that's going to kind of give us a live view of what is going on. You mentioned at the opening of the segment some of the concerns about the variants, particularly really about the South African variant, and vaccine efficacy. Well, the problem is, in a real world situation, we have millions of people who've been, affected, millions of people who've actually, been vaccinated. And so if we can track and see who is actually improving and who is not getting reinfected as a result of that, that's going to be so helpful in terms of really determining what vaccines we should be deploying in those circumstances.
And the problem is you may be infected, asymptomatic, and a carrier and spreader. Dr. Jonathan Kanter, thanks much.